The next morning, the air was colder than usual, a deep prairie cold that slipped through the walls and settled in the bones. Silas rose early, as he always did, and stoked the fire back to life before stepping outside to check the animals. The horses were restless, stomping and snorting, their breath curling like smoke in the cold. Something had spooked them in the night. He scanned the horizon. Nothing, just frost and wind. When he came back inside, Clara was sitting up in the cat, her blanket wrapped tightly around her shoulders, eyes following him with a mix of wariness and quiet gratitude. She looked better. Not good, but better. Some color had returned to her face. She sipped the broth he'd left on the stove, her fingers shaking slightly as she lifted the tin bowl. "You shouldn't be up yet," he said, voice low but firm. "I've been worse," she replied, her voice stronger than the day before, though her eyes didn't quite meet his. Silas said nothing. He didn't press her for more. Not yet. Clara sat in silence for a few moments before her gaze drifted toward the window. "It's quiet out here," she murmured. He nodded. "Too quiet for most. I used to think I wanted that," she said softly. Silence. Peace. No one telling me what to do. No one yelling. But her voice trailed off. "But now?" he asked. She didn't answer right away. Her fingers gripped the bowl a little tighter. "Now I don't know what I want, or where I belong." Silas felt those words settle in the air, like ash. He understood them better than most. For years, he'd asked himself the same question every time he looked in the mirror. Where do broken people go when the world no longer wants them? He walked to the stove and poured himself a mug of coffee. "You don't have to talk," he said after a long pause. "But if there's trouble behind you, I need to know." Clara looked down into her lap. Silence again, not the comfortable kind, but the kind that buzzed with the weight of unsaid things. Then, slowly, she set the bowl aside and drew something from the folds of her blanket, a folded piece of cloth, red and white, stained. Silas stepped closer. It was a sash like the kind worn around the waist by riders from the southern territories. Blood-soaked one end. "My brother wore this," she said. Her voice shook now, but she kept going. "He worked for a ranch near the border. Got mixed up in something. Land dispute," he said. "Men started showing up. Armed men, not lawmen, not ranchers either. Said we had something that belonged to them. We didn't." Her fingers tightened. "On the sash. One night they came, burned the house. My brother stayed behind to buy me time. I ran. I didn't stop until I got here." Silas took the cloth from her gently and studied it. The fabric was rough, handmade like something passed down in a family. The blood was long dried, but it told its own story. A last stand, a sacrifice. "You don't know who they were?" he asked. She shook her head. "They had no badges, no names, just scars, and horses, and guns. They said they'd find me." Silas walked to the window. The prairie looked as empty as ever, but his gut said otherwise. "You're not safe yet," he said. "I didn't think I would be," she whispered. He turned to her. "You are now?" There was something in his voice, not loud, not angry, just certain. It had the weight of a man who'd once lost everything, and was now quietly deciding that he wouldn't let it happen again. Clara looked up at him, studying his face like it held some clue she couldn't quite read. "Why are you helping me?" Silas stared into the fire for a long time before answering. "Because someone once helped me. Long time ago. When I didn't deserve it." The silence that followed felt different, like an understanding had been forged between two people who knew what it was to run, to lose, to carry grief like a second skin. As night fell again and the wind picked up outside, Silas loaded his rifle, checked the latch on the door, and pulled up a chair beside it. Clara, still wrapped in her blanket, watched him without speaking. Neither of them said it out loud, but both knew something was coming. And this time, Silas Boone wasn't planning to be alone when it arrived. Silas had carried many burdens in his life. Tools, fence posts, a broken heart, but never someone so light and still as the girl in his arms. She weighed almost nothing, like a shadow that had wandered too far from its owner. Her head lolled against his shoulder, damp strands of dark hair sticking to her forehead. He pushed open the cabin door with his boot and stepped inside. The room was dim, warmed by the last embers of the morning fire. Dust motes danced in the light from a single window. Silas knelt beside the cot, laying her down gently, his movements careful, almost reverent. She didn't stir. For a moment, he just watched her, unsure what to do, unsure even what he was feeling. It had been so long since anyone had needed him. Longer still since anyone had dared come near. He fetched a basin of water and a cloth, dipping it and wringing it out with steady hands. As he pressed the cool cloth to her forehead, she winced slightly but didn't wake. Her skin was feverish, her cheeks were smudged with dust, and now that he saw her up close, her face was streaked with bruises, fresh ones, along her jaw and temple. Not from the fall. Someone had hit her. Silas's jaw clenched. There was no doctor nearby. The closest town was a hard half-day's ride, and he wouldn't leave her alone, not in this state. He moved around the cabin with quiet urgency, lighting the stove, warming broth, crushing dried herbs into tea. Things he hadn't done in years. He barely recognized himself. And yet, it all came back, like muscle memory trained long ago, by a woman who once stood where the girl now lay. He didn't speak, not yet. But in his mind, questions bloomed like brushfire. Who was she? Where had she come from? Why was she alone? And what, by God, had she been running from? He returned to her side, propping her head up to spoon warm broth into her mouth. Most of it dribbled out, but she swallowed some. A flicker of life returned to her cheeks. She murmured something too soft to understand, and her lips parted, as if trying to form words. Easy now, he muttered, almost surprised at the sound of his own voice. It felt strange, foreign, but it seemed to settle her. For hours, he stayed by her side, feeding her slowly, changing the cloth, tending the fire. When she stirred again, her eyes fluttered open, hazy and glassy. She looked at the ceiling, then around the cabin. Confused, her gaze landed on him. She tried to sit up, panic flashing in her eyes, but he raised a hand and shook his head. "You're safe," he said gently, voice gravelly from years of disuse. She stared at him. Her breathing slowed. Silas pulled the chair closer and sat. "Can you speak?" he asked. Her lips parted, and after a few moments, a rasp of a whisper came. "Where am I?" "My place," he replied. "Middle of nowhere." A ghost of a smile flickered on her cracked lips. "That figures." He poured her a tin cup of tea and helped her drink. She clutched it like it was a lifeline, the heat shaking through her fingertips. After a long pause, she looked up and said, "Clara, my name's Clara." Silas nodded slowly. "Silas Boone." For a beat, neither spoke. The wind scratched at the window pane like a dog begging to be let in. But inside, the fire crackled, and for the first time in years, the cabin felt alive. "Thank you," Clara whispered. He looked away. "Ain't nothin', but it was something. More than he knew," as she drifted back to sleep, her hands wrapped around the tea like it held all the warmth left in the world. Silas sat back in his chair and watched the snow begin to fall beyond the window. Something had entered his life. Something wild, broken, and unexpected. And though he didn't know it yet, that moment, the moment she spoke her name, was the first stitch in a wound he thought would never close. The prairie had a way of swallowing sound, the kind of silence that stretched so long and wide, it could muffle even the loudest memories. Silas Boone had lived alone in that silence for over a decade, and he never once complained. Not to God, not to the wind, not to the ghosts he sometimes thought he saw, drifting through the heat shimmer. If the land spoke, it did so in whispers, rustling grass, the creak of the windmill, the low grunt of cattle in the distance. That was enough for him. Words had caused him too much pain once, so he gave them up. Silas's homestead sat at the edge of nowhere, where the red dirt turned to dust, and the sky never ended. The cabin was small, built by his own hands, a weather-worn structure that leaned slightly to the left. Like it too, had grown tired of standing straight. His days were all the same. Wake before dawn, feed the horses, mend what was broken, then ride the fence line till the sun hung low. At night, he'd sit on the porch with a tin cup of bitter coffee and stare into the horizon like he was waiting for something that would never come. The townsfolk 50 miles east had long stopped asking about him. At first, they called him that widowed fella, then the ghost rancher, and eventually they forgot his name altogether. Silas didn't mind. He preferred being a myth. People didn't knock on a myth's door. They didn't ask questions. They didn't bring news. Silence, he found, was easier to carry than conversation. Inside his cabin, things were arranged with military precision. Not because he liked order, but because it distracted him. The bed was always made tight. The firewood stacked even. The rifle cleaned every third day without fail. There were no pictures on the walls. No books on the shelf. Just tools, blankets, and an old rusted locket he kept in a drawer he never opened. There were moments, of course, when the silence grew too loud. When a sound like a girl's laughter in the wind, or a horse neighing too close to the house, would send his heart racing, expecting something or someone long gone. He never spoke about what had happened. Not to the preacher who came riding out once a year. Not to the doctor who patched up his arm that one time a wild steer threw him. The story lived behind his eyes and in the curve of his jaw. People saw it and they didn't press. But on one sharp morning, with frost still hugging the ground and the sun just beginning to rise over the hills, the silence broke. Silas was out, front feeding the chickens, when he heard it, a sound that didn't belong. Not wind, not coyote. It was faint, almost nothing. But his ears, trained to detect the smallest shift in nature's rhythm, caught it, a cry. Weak human. He turned toward the cabin. At first, he saw nothing. But then, just beyond the porch steps, he saw her, a figure, small, trembling, and barely upright. A girl. She took 2 shaky steps forward, one hand clutching something near her chest, and then she dropped to her knees like the earth had given way beneath her. Her head bowed, her shoulders shook with quiet sobs. For a second, Silas didn't move. He blinked it, not in disbelief, but in the way a man does when he's unsure if he's seeing a memory or a miracle. Then instinct took over. He dropped the feed bucket and strode forward. She was young, maybe 20, maybe less. Her dress was torn, stained with dirt and old blood. Her boots were missing. Her lips cracked. One hand still gripped what looked like a ragged piece of fabric, the other was scraped and bleeding. She looked up at him, barely conscious, and tried to speak. No words came, just a choked breath, and then she collapsed fully, face first into the dirt on his porch. The silence was gone now. In its place, a heartbeat, and for the first time in years, Silas Boone bent down, lifted something fragile from the dust, and carried it inside. The snow melted quickly over the next 2 days. The prairie, once white and brittle with frost, began to soften again under the weight of warmer winds. But with the thaw came unease, the kind of stillness that didn't feel like peace, more like waiting. Even the birds stayed quiet. Clara was healing. She could walk across the room now without stumbling, though her bruises hadn't faded. She helped with small tasks, sweeping the porch, feeding the chickens, organizing the shelves with a nervous sort of energy. Like movement kept her fear at bay. Silas didn't stop her. He could tell she needed the distraction. Still, her eyes often drifted toward the window. South, always south. On the third day, just past noon, Silas was working on the broken hinge of the barn door when his horse, Dusty, snorted sharply. Silas looked up. The animal was staring at the ridge, ears stiff, neck high. A moment later, he saw the glint. Metal saddle, movement. 2 riders, then 3, then 5. They came slow, not at a gallop, but not casual either. Men who wanted to be seen, but not heard until it was too late. Silas stood silently and brushed the dust from his gloves. He turned and strode back, toward the cabin. Not with panic, but purpose. Clara was by the fire, stirring a pot of beans. She turned when she heard the door open. Riders, Silas said simply. 5, maybe more behind. Her face went pale. How far? Half a mile. Clara put down the spoon. It's them, I know it is. Silas grabbed his rifle from the wall and checked the chamber. Get upstairs, stay out of sight. Don't come down unless I call. Clara didn't argue. She crossed the room and paused. At the stairs, don't talk to them, she said. They're not the kind that talk. He gave a slight nod. Neither am I. She vanished upstairs. Silas shut the door behind her, then stepped out onto the porch, rifle in hand, and waited. The men arrived, minutes later. 5 of them, just as he counted. All wore trail-worn coats, bandanas, and long coats that hung heavy with dust. One had a scar running from the corner of his mouth to his ear. Another had silver spurs that jingled faintly with every step. They stopped their horses a few yards from the porch. The man in front raised a hand and tipped his hat. Afternoon, he called. Silas didn't move. You lost. The man smiled thinly. Don't reckon so. Just looking for someone. Plenty of places to look. Silas said. She's young, about 20, dark hair. Might be limping, might be scared. Silas shifted the rifle slightly in his grip. I ain't seen anyone fitting that. The man tilted his head, still smiling. That right? Place looks like it's seen some company. Smoke in the chimney. 2 bowls by the fire. You come up here countin' soup bowls? Silas asked. Seems like a strange hobby. A flicker of something passed across the man's face. Not amusement anymore, but calculation. We got reason to believe she came this way, he said more firmly. She took something. Belongs to our employer. Funny how things get twisted. Silas replied. She told me she lost something. Her brother. The man's hand drifted down to the butt of his pistol. This don't concern you, old man. We don't want no trouble. You brought 5 guns to a quiet doorstep, Silas said flatly. Looks like you came for it. Silence. Then, the man leaned forward in his saddle. You got till nightfall. Then we come knockin' proper. He turned his horse sharply. The others followed. They rode off, but not far. Just down the ridge, where they could watch. Silas waited until they were out of sight, then stepped back into the cabin and bolted the door. Clara was already coming down the stairs, eyes wide. They know I'm here. They know enough, he said. They'll be back after sundown. What are we going to do? Silas poured fresh powder into the chamber of his second rifle. You're going to stay upstairs, and you? She asked. I'm going to remind them this house ain't empty. Clara looked at him, truly looked at him, and for the first time, saw not just a rancher, not just a loner, but a man who had once been dangerous, and maybe still was. She said nothing more. The prairie wind picked up, whispering through the cracks in the wood like ghosts warning of a coming storm. By the time the sun dipped below the horizon, the cabin was wrapped in a tense hush. Shadows stretched long across the prairie, and the wind that had whispered all day now roared like something alive. Silas moved like a man preparing for the end of something quiet, focused, without waste. He double-checked the latches on the windows, placed the spare rifle against the wall near the front door, and slid his old Colt .45 onto the table. His boots echoed faintly on the wooden floor. In the corner, the fire crackled low, more for light than warmth. He didn't want the smoke giving away too much. Upstairs, Clara sat on the floor near the attic window, her knees pulled to her chest. She clutched the red and white sash in both hands, the fabric twisted between her fingers. Every noise made her flinch, the creak of the floorboards, the whistle of wind through the eaves. She kept her eyes fixed on the ridge, and then she saw them. Shadows on horseback. Riding slow, confident, as if they owned the very ground they approached on. 6 this time. One more than earlier. Maybe more. Behind. Her heart thudded. She whispered. Down the stairs. They're coming. Silas had already seen. He stood on the porch, rifle slung in one hand, shotgun resting against the doorframe. His stance was relaxed, but his eyes were sharp, tracking every movement in the dusk. He didn't pace. He didn't breathe hard. He just waited. The riders stopped 20 yards out, forming a rough semicircle in the dying light. Their leader dismounted. Scarmouth, as Clara called him in her mind. He stepped forward slowly, his hand hovering near his holster. We gave you a chance, he called. Silas didn't answer. You think this girl's worth dying for? Still, no response. The man took another step forward. We ain't here to kill, unless we have to. But we'll drag her out of here one way or another. Silas finally spoke, calm and cold. You take one more step, and you'll be the first one under the dirt. The silence that followed was tight as a drawn bow. Then Scarmouth laughed, short, bitter. You think you're some kind of hero. I think I've had enough of men like you. And then, it began. One of the riders drew too fast. A flash of steel, a gun barked loud, sharp. Silas's rifle cracked an instant later. The rider toppled backward off his horse, dead before he hit the ground. The others scrambled to dismount it, firing blindly toward the cabin. Bullets shattered the porch post. Splinters flew. Silas ducked low, rolled to the left, and fired. Again, another rider screamed, clutching his leg as his horse bolted. Upstairs, Clara covered her mouth to keep from crying out. She backed away from the window, tears sliding down her cheeks as gunfire lit the night like lightning. Below. Silas reloaded with a speed that came not from panic, but experience. He moved with purpose, keeping low, using every inch of the porch's shadows. One more rider tried to rush the door, shotgun raised, but Silas was already waiting. Boom! That shotgun blast blew the man backward in a cloud of dust and blood. His body crumpled against the barn wall. Only 2 remained, Scarmouth and a rider with a wide-brimmed hat who'd hung back until now. Scarmouth looked at the scene, 3 of his men down. One crippled, the last hesitating. He spat into the dirt and raised his voice. She's not worth it, Boone. Silas stood slowly in the doorway, the barrel of his rifle aimed squarely at the man's chest. That's where you're wrong. Scarmouth stared at him a moment longer, then turned, grabbed the reins of the nearest surviving horse, and mounted. He didn't shout orders, he didn't threaten. He simply rode off. The last man followed. Silas stood there until the sound of hooves faded into the night. Only then did he lower the gun. Inside, Clara stumbled down the stairs, trembling. She looked around at the bullet holes, the blood, the silence. You could have died. Silas sat down slowly at the table, poured himself a tin cup of cold coffee, and took a breath. So could they. She walked to him, tears still shining in her eyes. Why did you protect me? He didn't answer right away, but when he looked at her, really looked, his expression softened. Because maybe I needed saving too. The next morning, the cabin was quiet, but not in the same way as before. Not the lonely, hollow silence that had haunted the ranch for years. No, this silence was different. It felt heavier somehow, full of breath and blood and memory. The kind that settles in your chest and stays there. Clara stood at the window, wrapped in a blanket, staring at the blood-streaked dirt in front of the porch. The bodies were gone. Silas had buried them himself before dawn. Not because he had to, but because it was the right thing to do. Even for men like that. She watched him now as he returned from the hill, shovel in hand, boots caked with prairie dust and grief. He looked older than he had the night before. Not weaker, just worn, like a man who had stood face to face with a version of himself he'd tried to bury years ago. When he stepped inside, she didn't speak, just nodded. He nodded back. After a while, Clara poured 2 cups of coffee, bitter and black, and they sat at the table in silence. She finally asked, "Who taught you to fight like that?" Silas stared into the cup like it held ghosts. "War," he said. Then afterward, "I ran with men who didn't want peace. Outlaws," he nodded. "You could say that. What made you stop?" Silas didn't answer right away. He leaned back, arms crossed. "A woman. She saw something in me no one else did," said I still. "Had a choice." Clara tilted her head. "What happened to her?" He looked toward the window out past the hills, where the wind was picking up again. "She's buried under the cottonwood by the creek. Died 5 winters ago." Clara said, "Nothing." What could she say? She'd buried someone too. They were both survivors of fire and loss, to ghosts with beating hearts, trying to figure out what came next. "I keep thinking about last night," she said finally. "How they didn't expect you to fight." Silas gave a tired smile. "That's the thing about silence. People mistake it for weakness." Clara hesitated. "Do you think they'll come back?" "With more men, maybe," he said, "but I don't think it'll be soon." Their leader's pride took a hit. Men like that don't rush back until they're sure of revenge. And when they do, he looked her in the eye. "We'll be ready." The way he said we made her throat tighten. It had been a long time since anyone had included her in anything, since someone had stood beside her instead of using her, blaming her, or running away. After breakfast, Clara went to the barn to help with the chores. Silas didn't ask her to, she just needed something to do with her hands. She mucked the stalls, brushed the mare, hauled water, fed the hens. Silas repaired the split rail in the corral, his movements slow but steady. They worked in rhythm, like they'd been doing it for years. Later that afternoon, a single rider appeared on the southern trail. Clara froze. Silas stepped in front of her, but the rider waved a white scrap of cloth and dismounted before even reaching the gate. He was young, maybe 20, with dust on his boots and sun in his eyes, no gun in sight. "I'm not with them," the boy said quickly. "I just came to warn you." Silas studied him silently. "They're regrouping," the boy continued. "Down in Bitter Creek, 20 or 30 men, maybe more. They want the girl, say she's got something that'll ruin their whole operation." Clara stepped forward. "What are they talking about?" The boy looked at her. "Your brother, before he died, he gave you a book, didn't he?" She blinked. "Yes, a ledger. I buried it in my saddlebag before I ran." "That ledger's full of names," the boy said. "Corrupt ranchers, bribes, land theft, proof. Your brother was going to take it to a federal marshal." Silas's eyes narrowed. "Why are you helping us?" The boy looked down. "My father's name is in that book." He turned his horse and rode off before they could say anything else. Clara and Silas stood there, wind tugging at their clothes, the weight of the truth settling in. This wasn't just about a girl running from violence. This was about justice, and it wasn't over yet. 2 days after the rider's warning, Clara stood at the edge of the porch, saddlebag in hand. The prairie wind had died down, but her heart hadn't. She could feel it pounding in her throat like hooves on dry earth. The ledger was packed hidden, beneath a ragged blanket, beneath a loaf of bread. Beneath her fear, Silas stepped out behind her, holding her horse's reins. "You're sure about this?" he asked. She turned. "If I keep hiding, they'll keep hunting. But if I deliver this ledger to the marshal, it ends." Silas looked away, jaw tight. "They'll try to stop you before you ever reach him." "I know." He handed her the reins. "Then I'm going with you." She blinked. "What?" "No, Bitter Creek. I know how men like those think. And I've got debts in that town I'd rather pay standing tall." Clara nodded slowly. She didn't say thank you. He didn't need her to. They understood each other now, two broken things mending in the same sun. They left before sunrise. The trail to Bitter Creek was long and lonely. 3 days across the wide open plains, through fields that once carried buffalo and now only held the rustle of dry grass. They traveled by night, rested by day, and kept their backs to the wind. On the second night, while camping near a dry riverbed, Clara finally asked, "What did you do in Bitter Creek?" Silas didn't look up from the fire. "Shot a man who deserved it. Problem was, he had friends, the kind with badges." Clara stared into the flames. "That's why you disappeared." He nodded. "Figured I'd serve a better sentence out here than in their kind of jail." They didn't speak much after that. When they finally reached Bitter Creek, it was just before dusk. The town hadn't changed much, wooden storefronts leaning under their own weight, dust curling through the alleyways like old whispers. A crooked sign outside the saloon still read Delaney's. The sheriff's office stood at the corner, paint peeling, door cracked open. Silas pointed to a small white building near the edge of town. "That's the telegraph office. The marshal's contact. If the man's still alive, he'll know what to do." Clara dismounted, heart pounding, clutching the saddlebag to her chest. But as they crossed the street, a voice called out behind them. "Well, I'll be damned." Silas stopped cold. A man stepped out of the saloon. Wide shoulders, leather vest, silver star pinned crooked on his chest. "Sheriff Elias Dunn, didn't think I'd see you again." "Boone," he said, voice like sandpaper soaked in whiskey. "I figured you died in a ditch." Silas didn't flinch. Still standing, Dunn's eyes drifted to Clara. "And who's this?" "Your daughter." Clara stepped forward, chin high. "I'm here to see the marshal's man. I have something he'll want. Do you now?" Dunn's hand dropped to the butt of his gun. "Funny. You come riding into town the same week I get a telegram about a girl carrying stolen property." Silas moved in front of her. "That ledger has proof. You and your friends can't bury this one." Dunn smirked. "Who do you think taught those boys how to bury?" And just like that, 3 more men stepped out from the shadows. One behind the telegraph office. Another by the feed store. The last from the alley. "Guns drawn. Hand it over," Dunn said. "Nice and easy." Clara looked at Silas, his face steady, unreadable. And then she did something no one expected. She turned and ran, straight into the telegraph office. Saddlebag clutched to her chest. Dunn swore, "Get her!" But as the gunman moved, Silas drew first. Crack, one fell. Boom, the man near the feed store dropped. Dunn dove for cover, firing wildly. Silas rolled behind a water trough. returned fire, and clipped the last man in the leg. Clara burst through the back door of the telegraph office seconds later, followed by a gray-bearded clerk with a pistol of his own. "She's telling the truth," the clerk shouted. "I've seen the names. We're wiring the federal marshal now." Dunn froze. The town around them had gone quiet, eyes peering from windows, from behind barrels, from upstairs balconies, and for the first time in years, Silas saw it, fear in Elias Dunn's eyes. Not fear of bullets, but fear of the truth. The morning after the gunfire in Bitter Creek felt like waking from a long, bitter dream. Smoke still hung in the streets, and the echoes of bullets seemed to cling to the wooden walls. But something had shifted. People came out of their homes. Doors creaked open that hadn't moved in years. The town had lived under a shadow, and now someone had dared to strike a match. Clara sat at the edge of the marshal's desk, fingers wrapped tightly around a cup of coffee that had long gone cold. She hadn't spoken much since the telegram had been sent, but her eyes stayed sharp, watching everything, as if expecting the wind to change again. Silas stood near the window, arms crossed, a fresh bandage across his shoulder. He'd taken a graze in the firefight, nothing serious, but enough to remind him that age and bullets were poor companions. Across the desk, the telegraph clerk wiped his brow. "Message is through," he said. "Federal marshal will be here by week's end." He sounded interested. "Interested?" Clara asked, voice dry. The clerk chuckled nervously. "When I mentioned the names in that ledger," he stopped breathing for a moment. They waited. By midday, word had spread. Townsfolk, once silent and afraid, now gathered near the sheriff's office, whispering, pointing. Some brought food for Clara. One old woman handed Silas a small Bible and touched his arm, like he was a preacher come to drive out devils. Then the biggest surprise of all came. A young man stepped into the office, clean clothes, freshly shaven, holding a worn hat. In his hands, he looked Clara in the eye. "I'm Levi," he said. "Your brother was my friend." She stood slowly, unsure whether to run or collapse. He trusted you." Levi nodded. "We worked together gathering names, dates, documents." He knew they were stealing land, not just from ranchers, but from widows, war veterans, even native families who'd been given title by treaty. "And you didn't warn him they were coming?" Silas asked coldly. Levi flinched. "I tried. By the time I got back to the cabin, he was already gone." Clara swallowed the lump rising in her throat. "He told me once that truth would make enemies." Silas looked toward the window. The truth made graves. 3 days later, the marshal arrived. He wasn't what anyone expected. He came without a badge on his chest, just a long coat, a stack of papers under his arm, and a look that could split stone. He didn't say much. He didn't need to. He took the ledger. He took statements. He took the town's silence and turned it into a storm. By nightfall, 2 deputies had already shackled the surviving men from Dunn's circle. The sheriff himself tried to run, made it halfway to the stables before Silas stepped in front of him, arms crossed. "You ran things for a long time," Silas said. "Time to ride out in chains." Dunn looked him over with disgust. "You think this changes anything? There will always be men like me." "Maybe," Silas replied, "but today, you're the one losing." The next week brought headlines. Federal papers mentioned the Bitter Creek ledger. A few called it the Prairie Exposé. Names fell from power. Judges were reassigned. Land was restored. Clara stayed. Not because she was told to, because she wanted to. She helped the telegraph clerk organize his records. She helped old women write letters to relatives they hadn't seen in decades. She even helped build a new schoolhouse, one that would bear her brother's name when the plaque was nailed above the door. And Silas, he didn't return to the cabin. He sold the land, most of it, and bought a small house on the edge of Bitter Creek. Just enough room for 2 horses, a garden, and the occasional visitor. One morning, he found Clara sitting on the porch with a cup of tea and a book of poems she never read out loud. He sat beside her. For a while, neither spoke. Then she said, "Do you ever miss the silence?" Silas watched a hawk soar across the pink sky, the cry of morning echoing off the rooftops. "No," he said, his voice low and steady. "I've heard enough silence to last a lifetime." They sat there, side by side, as Bitter Creek woke around them, no longer a town ruled by fear, but one held together by truth, grit, and 2 souls who refused to stay broken.